children, welcome to English Literature class. In your previous session, I introduced the story Hearts and Hands. I have discussed about the author of the story, its summary, theme and setting. Today, in this session, I will discuss the main characters of the story, its title, style and critical appreciation. By the end of this session, you will be able to describe the characters in your own words. You will also be able to understand the title, style and critical appreciation of the story. Let's begin the class, children. Now let's discuss the character of Mr. Easton. Mr. Easton is one of the main characters in the story Hearts and Hands. The story is set in a train to Denver. An elegantly dressed woman named Miss Fairchild is seated in the train when two men arrive and take the seat facing her. One of the two men is Easton. He is a handsome person with frank countenance and manner. He is handcuffed to the other man seated beside him. Easton greets the young woman as he knows her. He feels embarrassed and uncomfortable before the young woman due to his handcuffs. She begins to chat with him but continues to stare at the handcuffs. Meaning of elegantly dressed means gracefully attired. Countenance, facial expression. Embarrassed, feeling of shame. Stare, continuous look. Now children, Mr. Easton is a young handsome man with a bold, frank facial expression and manner. As soon as he entered the coach, Miss Fairchild, his old acquaintance, recognized him and got interested in talking to him. Initially, Mr. Easton felt little nervous and embarrassed because of his handcuffs. But he composed himself and clasped Miss Fairchild's fingers with his left hand and spoke to her with a smile. But Miss Fairchild kept on staring at his handcuff. The glow fades from her cheeks and the glad look in her eyes changed to bewildered horror. The other man senses Easton's embarrassment and gives an explanation that Easton is a marshal and the two are headed for Leavenworth prison. Fades, faints. Bewildered, confused. Headed for, are going towards. On noticing Mr. Easton handcuffed with another man, Miss Fairchild appeared to be horrified. On observing this, the glum-faced man interfered and said that Mr. Easton was the marshal who was taking him to the Leavenworth prison for counterfeiting. But Easton is not really a marshal. It is the marshal who presents him as a marshal. He is a counterfeiter in reality. The two passengers in the train reveal that he is a counterfeiter. One says that he is too young to be a marshal and the other says, "Did you ever know an officer to handcuff a prisoner to his right hand?" These remarks by the two passengers reveal the true identity of Mr. Easton. Meaning of marshal is an officer. Counterfeiter, a person who makes an exact copy of something valuable. So children, the suspense of the story was disclosed by one of the two passengers in the coach who had been listening to the conversation, remarked that Mr. Easton appeared to be too young to be a marshal. The other passenger corrected him by saying that Mr. Easton was not the marshal and the other man was actually the marshal. as no marshal would handcuff his own right hand to the prisoner's left hand. Let's discuss the next very important character of the story, that is Miss Fairchild. Miss Fairchild in the story Hearts and Hands, the most important character, is elegantly dressed and is traveling in a train to Denver. She is rich, materialistic, and self-centered. She is seated on the train when two men arrive and take the seat facing her. She knows one of them, whose name is Easton. She begins to chat with him, but is surprised to discover that he is handcuffed to the man seated beside him. She looks tense and feels embarrassed. Elegantly dressed means gracefully attired. Materialistic, believing that having money and possession is the most important thing in life. Self-centered, selfish. Surprised, amazed. Embarrassed, feeling of shame. Now children, Miss Fairchild is an interesting character with a lovely smile. She is elegantly dressed and seems to be a smart, stylish and rich woman who loves traveling. On seeing the young and handsome Mr. Easton, she is attracted to him, and her heart seems to be filled with images of her happy past with him. But on noticing Mr. Easton handcuffed with another man, she appears to be horrified and anxious. The glow fades from her cheeks and the glad look in her eyes changes to bewildered horror. She is unable to reconcile with the situation and stares at him in disbelief. To ease her bewilderment and embarrassment, the other man reveals that he is a marshal, and all marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoners to keep them away from getting away. She is slightly relieved. As the two men stand near the smoker car, the young woman bids goodbye to Mr. Easton and goes away. Meaning of fades means faints. Reconcile, restore friendly relations between. Disbelief, disinterest. To ease her bewilderment, to make her feel comfortable. Relieved, relaxed. Now children, as I told you earlier that on noticing Mr. Easton handcuffed with another man, she appears to be horrified and anxious. Now on seeing the expressions of horror and distress on Miss Fairchild's face, the glum-faced man, without caring for his own reputation, tells Miss Fairchild that he is the prisoner and Mr. Easton is a marshal. He also tells him that all marshals handcuff their prisoners to their own right hand so that they do not run away. Then Miss Fairchild feels relieved. At the end, the young woman bids goodbye to Mr. Easton and goes away. Let's have a look on another character of the story, the other man, that is Marshal. The other man who plays an important role in the story is a ruffled, glum-faced person. He is heavily built and roughly dressed, yet he is kind and helpful, his heart in the right place, and so extends the hand to help his companion. He is handcuffed with Mr. Easton. Both are going in a train to Denver. They enter the train and seat themselves in front of an elegantly dressed woman named Miss Fairchild. Mr. Easton and Miss Fairchild engage themselves in conversation because they know each other. Ruffled means disarranged, glum-faced having glooming appearance, roughly lacking gentleness, companion, mate, engage, busy. An unnamed man, the Marshal is rough, sad-looking and heavily built. He has handcuffed himself to a convict, Mr. Easton, whom he is taking to the prison in Leavenworth. He has a compassionate heart. On a train to Denver, Mr. Easton meets a gracefully attired lady, Miss Fairchild. Mr. Easton feels slightly embarrassed to talk to her because of his handcuffs, but afterwards they engage themselves in conversation. Miss Fairchild is surprised to see Mr. Easton in handcuffs. She is tense and embarrassed and stares at him in disbelief. The other man is observant and intelligent. He observed that both Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton are feeling embarrassed. So he comes to their rescue. He is sympathetic and helpful. To ease the concern of Miss Fairchild and remove the embarrassment of Easton, he comes forward with an explanation that Easton is the Marshal and he is taking him to the Leavenworth prison. Both feel relaxed. He saves the otherwise unpleasant and uncomfortable situation. It is in the way that he plays an important role in the story. The meaning of stares, continuous look. Observant, good at noticing things around. Rescue, to save from unpleasant situation. Sympathetic, who understands other people's feelings. Relaxed, comfortable. The other man is a keen observer. Though Miss Fairchild was talking to Mr. Easton, yet she was continuously staring at the handcuffs. The other man is a keen observer and a good judge of human behavior. He observes Miss Fairchild's expressions and could make out the reason for her horrified look after seeing the handcuffs. Thus, without caring for his own reputation, he tells Miss Fairchild that he is the convict and Mr. Easton is a marshal. Then both feels relaxed. So children, the marshal's willingness to lie for Mr. Easton shows that he is a dutiful man with a compassionate heart who would help anybody in trouble. Let's talk about the title of the story. The title of the story, Hearts and Hands, is suggestive and appropriate. It deals with the emotional attachment of a young girl to a counterfeiter. Miss Fairchild, the young girl, is seated on the train when two men arrive and take the seat facing Miss Fairchild. She is surprised to see that he is handcuffed to the man seated beside him. She sees that right hand is bound at the wrist by the shining bracelet to the left hand of his companion. She gets hurt and becomes tense. To ease her tension, the man with Easton gives an explanation that Easton is the marshal and the two are headed for Leavenworth prison. Miss Fairchild is relieved of the tension, thus the story has a suitable title. The meaning of suggestive is being a sign of something. Appropriate, suitable. Bound, tied. To ease her tension, to make her feel comfortable. Are headed for, are going towards. Relieved, relaxed. Now children, O. Henry has aptly named the story Hearts and Hands. The plot of the story is related to the theme of showing compassion and not judging people by their outer appearances. The story begins with the two people, Mr. Easton and the glum-faced man, handcuffed together. Miss Fairchild was misled by the unnamed man about the identity of Mr. Easton, as he wanted to save Mr. Easton from an embarrassment. Children, the hands part of the title signifies handcuffs, which are significant for revealing the true identities of two men. And the hearts part of the title explain the compassion shown by the glum-faced man in the story. Now, children, we will discuss style of the story, Hearts and Hands. O. Henry's style is typical. It is to build a story in such a way as to lead to a surprise ending. This is what is noticeable in Hearts and Hands too. Until the last sentence, the lady, as also the reader, believes what Mr. Easton's companion has said. Only a passenger's remark put the whole episode in a new light. The criminal is the real Marshal and the Marshal is the real criminal. The sudden turn is a kind of reversal. The term smile with tears really fits in with the stylistic scheme of O. Henry. Like most of O. Henry's stories, the author builds up suspense. In the beginning of the story, the young man looks like a marshal from his appearance, whereas the other fat and glum-faced man appears to be a prisoner. The lady in the story as well as the readers are led to view these two men as the narrator wants. But at the end, the readers are made to realize that Mr. Easton is the culprit and the other man is a marshal. Let's discuss critical appreciation. A single episode. A single episode means a brief unit of action in a story that takes place at one time. The story Hearts and Hands depicts a brief episode on a train to Denver. It involves three main characters and two minor characters. The story Hearts and Hands deals with a brief episode on a train to Denver. An elegantly dressed woman named Miss Fairchild is seated on the train when two men arrive and take the seat facing her. One of them is Mr. Easton. Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton engage themselves in conversation as they know each other. When she sees Mr. Easton in handcuffs, she is baffled and surprised. She stares at the handcuffs in disbelief. Mr. Easton also feels embarrassed and uncomfortable. In order to ease the concern of Miss Fairchild and remove the embarrassment of Mr. Easton, other man comes to their rescue. He comes forward with an explanation that Mr. Easton is a marshal and is taking the prisoner to Leavenworth prison. Both are relaxed. Thus, the story deals with a single episode. In the story Hearts and Hands, a young lady, Miss Fairchild, was sitting in one of the coaches in a train. The two persons boarded the train and sat in front of her. Of the two men, Miss Fairchild recognized one of them as an old friend, Mr. Easton, and started conversing with him. She was shocked to see his hands handcuffed with the other man. However, the other man convinced Miss Fairchild that he was the prisoner who was being taken to the prison by Mr. Easton, a marshal. After this, Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton conversed with each other until the glum-faced Marshal and Mr. Easton departed to the smoker room. Irony. Children, irony is a literary technique which is used to convey a meaning that is opposite to its literal meaning in the story. Let's read. The story presents an ironical situation with a surprise ending. The irony at the end of the story makes the story interesting. The unexpected revelation about Mr. Easton surprises the readers. When the two passengers in the train remark that Mr. Easton is not a marshal but a counterfeiter, they strike an ironical note. One says that he is too young to be a marshal, and the other says, "Did you ever know an officer to handcuff the prisoner to his right hand?" These remarks point out the irony in the story. Here, O. Henry has artfully depicted in the story that appearances can misrepresent reality. The unexpected disclosure about Mr. Easton surprises the readers. When one of the two passengers in the coach, who had been listening to their conversation, remarked that Mr. Easton appeared to be too young to be a marshal, the other passenger corrected him by saying that Mr. Easton was not the marshal and the other man was actually the marshal, as no marshal would handcuff his own right hand to the prisoner's left hand. The story Hearts and Hand is full of irony, situational irony, verbal irony, and dramatic irony. Let's read situational irony. It happens at the beginning of the story when the two men enter the train. Of the two men, the handsome-looking man appeared to be a marshal, whereas the other man, who was fat, rough, and glum-faced, appeared to be a prisoner. But in reality, the handsome young man, that is Mr. Easton, was a counterfeiter, whereas the other man was a marshal. Children, situational irony happens when a contrast is there between what is expected to occur and what actually happens. In the story, there is a mismatch between their appearances and the reality, which is revealed at the end of the story that Mr. Easton, who seems to be a marshal, was a counterfeiter, whereas the other man was a marshal. Let's understand what is verbal irony. Now, it happens when a character says one thing and its meaning is entirely different. There are many examples of verbal irony in the story. These are: he is taking me to Leavenworth prison. It's 7 years for counterfeiting. Here in this sentence, the glum-faced man wants Miss Fairchild to assume that he has got a 7-year sentence for counterfeiting, when actually it is the handsome young man, Mr. Easton, who is being taken to prison. I had to do something. Here, Mr. Easton told Miss Fairchild to understand what the something truly was. It is a verbal irony. Mr. Easton knows his business. Here, the glum-faced man said that the business Mr. Easton knows is not the business of being a marshal, but of being a counterfeiter. This is a verbal irony. My butterfly days are over, I fear. Here, Mr. Easton said it. According to him, his freedom had been curtailed because of his being sentenced to prison. But Miss Fairchild thinks that Mr. Easton was referring to his job with criminals justice system, because of which he won't have freedom to do whatever he used to do earlier. I can't deny a petition for tobacco. Mr. Easton said it. He means to say that he cannot deny a petition for tobacco from his companion, because he is a prisoner and under the command of his companion, who is actually a marshal. Now, dramatic irony. Now, it happens when the reader perceives something that a character in the story does not know. Miss Fairchild said, "Money is not everything, but people always misunderstand things and remain stupid." In the above sentence, Miss Fairchild says that people misunderstand things, whereas she herself does not understand who the real prisoner is. Narrative. Let's read about narrative. The story is narrated in a simple language and lucid style. The episode begins and ends in a straightforward manner. The remarks by the two passengers at the end of the story are significant because they reveal the irony in the story. These unexpected remarks reveal the truth about the character of Mr. Easton. The simple sentence at the end of the story is brilliant and surprises the readers. Sting in the story is really effective. The story is narrated in third person. At the beginning of the story, the young man looked like a marshal from his appearance, whereas the other fat and glum-faced man appeared as a prisoner. It is only at the end that the reader comes to know about the reality, when the true identities of those two men are revealed, which surprises the readers as well. This is sting in the story. So, children, that's all for today's session. I hope you have understood the story well. Your homework for today is to learn all the characters. Thank you.